Dan wiped the sweat from his brow as he climbed over a pile of twisted metal, his boots crunching against the charred remains of a crashed ship. The air smelled of burnt wiring and scorched earth. The crash had happened just hours ago, and Dan, like always, had been quick to check if there was anything useful left behind. Vestenine wasn't the kind of place where people asked questions. It was a quiet colony on the edge of human space, mostly filled with miners, mechanics, and traders. Dan had lived here for years, fixing broken machines and trading scrap for credits. He wasn't a hero, just a guy trying to survive. As he moved through the wreckage, he noticed something unusual. Most crashed ships left behind bodies, humans, aliens, or whatever was unfortunate enough to be inside. But this one was empty. No bodies, no escape pods, just silence. Then he heard it. A faint sound, like someone breathing heavily. He froze, listening. The sound came from behind a broken panel near the edge of the wreck. Carefully, he stepped closer, gripping the metal and pulling it aside. His heart skipped a beat. Huddled inside the wreckage was a girl. She wasn't human. Her skin was a soft silver, smooth and almost metallic under the dim light. Her hair, white as fresh snow, clung to her face, and her large violet eyes were filled with fear. She wore a torn suit, dark blue with strange symbols running along the seams. Blood, thick and dark, stained her side, and she held her arm tightly against her body, as if in pain. Dan knew he should leave. If the colony authorities found out he had helped an alien, it could mean trouble. Some people didn't trust aliens, especially after what had happened on other colonies. But something about the way she looked at him, scared and helpless, made it impossible to walk away. He crouched down, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" The girl flinched. Her breathing grew faster, and she pressed herself against the wreckage, as if trying to disappear. Dan sighed. Of course, she didn't understand him. "Look," he tried again, pointing to himself. "Dan." Then he pointed to her, waiting. She hesitated, her violet eyes studying him. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Dan glanced at the wound on her side. It didn't look good. If he left her here, she wouldn't last long. The nights on Vestenine were freezing, and predators roamed the wastelands outside the colony. He couldn't just abandon her. He slowly reached into his bag, pulling out a small water bottle. He unscrewed the cap, took a sip to show it was safe, then held it out to her. The girl watched him warily before, with shaky fingers, taking the bottle. She brought it to her lips, drinking carefully. "There you go," Dan said. "See, I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't answer, but she didn't run either. That was a start. Dan looked around. He couldn't stay here much longer. Someone might come looking. He had a small workshop on the outskirts of the colony, far enough from the main settlement that no one would notice if he brought someone in. He glanced back at the girl. "All right," he muttered. "Guess I'm doing this." He carefully moved closer, reaching out his hand. The girl stiffened, but she didn't pull away. Dan gently placed his hand on her uninjured arm and nodded toward the distance. "Come with me." She didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, she nodded. Dan exhaled in relief. Helping her up was difficult. She was weak, barely able to stand, and winced with every step. He ended up half carrying her, her arm draped over his shoulder as they moved through the wreckage. The journey back to his workshop was slow. He kept checking over his shoulder, making sure no one was following. When they finally reached his place, a small metal structure with a rusted roof, he pushed open the door and led her inside. The girl collapsed onto an old cot, her breathing shallow. Dan hurried to grab his first aid kit. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to clean a wound. As he worked, she watched him with tired, wary eyes. "You're safe here," Dan told her, not sure if she understood. "Just rest." She didn't reply, but as he finished bandaging her wound, she did something unexpected. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve, her fingers tightening slightly. Dan looked at her in surprise. Even without words, he understood what she meant. She didn't want him to leave. And somehow, he knew, this was just the beginning. Dan sat on the edge of his workbench, watching the alien girl as she rested on the cot. The soft hum of the workshop's power generator filled the small space, mixing with the occasional flicker of the dim overhead lights. He had cleaned and bandaged her wound as best as he could, but she still looked weak. Her breathing was slow, steady, yet her violet eyes remained alert, scanning the room with a mixture of caution and exhaustion. She didn't trust him yet. That much was obvious. Dan wasn't sure what to do next. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was just a mechanic, not some diplomat or scientist who studied alien species. The girl, whoever she was, needed help, but how was he supposed to communicate with her? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, this is awkward," he muttered. The girl blinked at him, but didn't respond. Dan stood up and walked over to a small storage cabinet. He pulled out a metal tray with a few protein bars and a fresh bottle of water. Whatever species she was, she needed food to survive. He unwrapped one of the protein bars and took a bite, chewing slowly to show her it was safe. Then he placed the rest of the food on the tray and set it beside her. She hesitated, staring at the food. Her silver fingers twitched slightly as if debating whether to take it. Dan sat back down, giving her space. "Go ahead. Eat." She reached out, cautiously picking up the protein bar. She turned it over in her hands, studying it carefully before taking a small bite. Her expression remained neutral as she chewed, but she didn't spit it out, which was a good sign. "Guess that means it's edible for you," Dan said. She took another bite, eating slowly but steadily. Dan leaned back, crossing his arms. "So, what's your story? You crash here by accident, or was someone after you?" He didn't expect an answer, but speaking out loud made things feel less strange. The girl stopped eating for a moment. Her fingers tightened slightly around the protein bar. Dan noticed her reaction. "Someone was after you, he guessed. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Her expression gave away enough. Dan sighed. "Figures. Nothing ever crashes out here without a reason." For a while, they sat in silence. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the generator and the occasional rustling as she finished her food. Once she was done, she set the empty wrapper aside and looked at Dan. For the first time, she seemed to study him instead of the room. Her violet eyes scanned his face, his hands, his clothes. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand something. Dan pointed to himself again. "Dan." She blinked. He tapped his chest. "Dan," he repeated. Then he pointed to her, waiting. She hesitated, then softly whispered, "Nira." Dan felt a small wave of relief. "Progress." He nodded. Nira. Her name sounded strange on his tongue, but she didn't seem to mind. She just kept watching him, as if trying to decide whether he was truly safe. Dan stood up and walked over to his workbench, grabbing a small tablet device. He pulled up a simple drawing app and quickly sketched a rough image of a spaceship. Then he turned the tablet toward her and pointed at the picture. "You came in that ship." Nara looked at the drawing, then nodded slowly. Dan erased the sketch and drew another, a larger ship, something that looked more menacing, like a hunter's vessel. He tapped the screen again. "Was someone following you?" Nira stiffened. Her violet eyes darkened, and her fingers curled into fists. She gave a single, small nod. Dan let out a breath. "Great. So, whoever they are, they might come looking for you." Nira's gaze flickered to the door, as if expecting someone to break in at any moment. Her body tensed, and for the first time, Dan saw something else in her expression. Fear. Dan scratched his chin, thinking, "All right, we gotta be careful." He glanced at her wound. "You need time to heal. Until then, you stay here." She didn't respond, but she didn't protest either. Dan turned off the tablet and placed it aside. He looked at Nira again, noting how exhausted she looked. "You should rest." She hesitated, glancing at him warily. Dan sighed and stepped back. "I'll be over there," he said, pointing to a chair near the workbench. "I'm not going anywhere." Nira seemed to consider this. After a long pause, she slowly leaned back onto the cot. Her eyes remained on him for a while, but eventually they fluttered shut. Dan exhaled. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random crash. Someone had been chasing Nira, and if they were still out there, they wouldn't stop until they found her. Dan wasn't sure why, but he felt a strange sense of responsibility toward her. Maybe it was because she had no one else. Maybe it was because, despite everything, she hadn't tried to run away. Either way, she was here now. And somehow, Dan knew, she wasn't going to leave his side anytime soon. Dan awoke to a strange sound, soft but urgent. It took him a moment to realize it wasn't coming from his usual alarm or the hum of his workshop's generator. Blinking away his drowsiness, he lifted his head and saw Nira standing near the small window, her silver fingers pressed against the glass. She was trembling. Dan sat up quickly. "What's wrong?" Nira didn't answer, but her wide violet eyes told him everything. He followed her gaze toward the window, where the distant glow of searchlights swept across the dark wasteland outside. His stomach tightened. Someone was looking for her. Dan silently moved to the window, careful not to be seen. The searchlights came from sleek, black drones hovering in the distance. They weren't from the colony. He had seen those before, slow and bulky, meant for security patrols. These drones were different. Faster, smarter, purpose-built for hunting. For hunting someone like Nira. He turned back to her. "They're after you, aren't they?" Nira didn't need to answer. Her shaking hands and frightened eyes said enough. Dan clenched his jaw. This was bad. He had taken in a wounded girl, thinking she was just another lost traveler in need of help. But now he realized the truth. She was being hunted, and by someone who had the resources to send out high-tech search drones. His small workshop was sturdy but not impenetrable. If those drones scanned the area and detected Nira's presence, more would come. And next time, they wouldn't just be machines. Dan ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He needed a plan. "Nira," he said, keeping his voice low, "we can't stay here. If they find us, we're both in trouble." Nira turned to him, fear still in her eyes, but she nodded. She understood. Dan moved quickly, gathering supplies. He stuffed a small backpack with food, tools, and an old energy scanner. It wasn't much, but it was all he could carry. He had no idea how long they would need to hide, but he had to be ready. Nira hesitated as he packed. Then she reached out and touched his sleeve, her grip light but desperate. Dan stopped. "What is it?" She opened her mouth, struggling to form words. "Danger." It was the first full word she had spoken to him. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but filled with tension. Dan nodded. "Yeah, I figured that part out." She shook her head. "More. Coming." Dan's chest tightened. More were coming. He didn't ask how she knew. Somehow, she felt it. And if she was right, they had even less time than he thought. He threw the backpack over his shoulder and grabbed his old coat. "All right, we need to go." A sharp beep filled the air. Dan's heart jumped. He spun toward the sound. It was coming from his energy scanner, which he had left on the workbench. The screen flickered, displaying a bright red signal. Something, or someone, was heading straight for them. Nira gasped, stepping back. Her breathing grew fast and unsteady, her hands clenching into fists. Dan could see it, the sheer panic in her eyes. He grabbed her arm gently. "Hey, breathe. We're getting out of here." She swallowed hard and nodded. Dan moved to the back of the workshop, where an old metal hatch led into an underground storage tunnel. It wasn't much, just a leftover from when this place had been a mining outpost, but it would get them out unseen. He pulled the hatch open. Go. Nera hesitated only for a second before climbing down. Dan followed, shutting the hatch behind them. The tunnel was dark and narrow, the walls damp with condensation from the old mining equipment. The air smelled of rust and oil, but at least it was safe. For now. Dan pulled out a small flashlight and led the way. This tunnel runs under the colony, he explained. It's old, but if we're lucky, we can come out near the scrapyard. Nera walked beside him, her breathing still uneven but calmer than before. She kept looking back, as if expecting someone to be right behind them. Dan kept his voice low but firm. We'll be okay. She looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face. Then, softly, she said, Why? Help. Dan slowed his steps. It was a fair question. He had no reason to risk his life for an alien girl he had just met. He thought for a moment before answering. Because you needed help, he said simply. Nera stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she nodded, as if accepting his answer. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound being their footsteps against the tunnel floor. Dan kept checking the energy scanner, making sure they weren't being followed. The red signal had faded, but that didn't mean the danger was over. As they neared the exit, Nera suddenly stopped. Her body went rigid, her breath hitching. Dan turned. What is it? Nera pressed a hand against the tunnel wall, her expression twisting into one of deep focus. It was like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she whispered, They know. Dan's pulse spiked. Who knows? Nera turned to him, fear flashing in her eyes. Hunters. Dan's grip tightened on the flashlight. They weren't just being chased. They were being watched. And if Nera was right, the real danger hadn't even begun yet. Dan's heart pounded as he and Nera hurried through the underground tunnel. The dim beam of his flashlight flickered against the rough walls, casting long, eerie shadows. The air was damp, thick with the scent of rust and old machinery. The further they went, the heavier the silence became, broken only by their hurried footsteps. Nera stayed close, her breathing shallow but controlled. She had said only 2 words before. They know. Dan didn't doubt her. Whoever had been chasing her wasn't just searching blindly. They had found a way to track her. Whether it was technology or something else, Dan wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. Staying in the tunnels too long was a risk. We're almost there, he said, keeping his voice low. The exit leads to the scrapyard. We can hide there, maybe find a way off-world. Nera didn't reply, but she nodded. He could tell she was exhausted. She had been wounded, scared, and now forced to run again. Yet she didn't complain. She just kept moving. Dan had to admit, she was strong. After several minutes, they reached a rusted metal ladder leading up to a heavy hatch. Dan motioned for Nera to wait as he climbed up first. He pressed his ear against the hatch, listening. Silence. Slowly, he turned the handle and pushed it open, peeking out. The scrapyard stretched before him. A maze of broken ships, spare parts, and rusted machinery. No searchlights. No drones. For now, they were alone. Dan climbed out and gestured for Nera to follow. She hesitated only briefly before stepping up onto the surface. The cool night air brushed against her silver skin, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Dan scanned the area. The scrapyard was massive, filled with places to hide. He led Nera behind a stack of old ship parts and crouched down. We need a plan, he muttered. Nera sat beside him, hugging her knees. Her energy seemed drained. Dan pulled out a water bottle from his bag and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, drinking slowly. Dan studied her closely. She had barely spoken, but she understood him well enough. She had reacted to danger before he even noticed it. And those hunters, the ones searching for her, they weren't ordinary. There was more to Nira than he had realized. "You knew they were coming," he said carefully. "How?" Nira lowered the bottle. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I feel them." Dan frowned. "Feel them?" She placed a hand on her chest, as if trying to explain. "Not see. Not hear. Feel." Dan exhaled. He wasn't sure what to make of that, but it made sense. She had warned him before the scanner even picked up a signal. If she could sense the hunters, that meant they still weren't safe. "They won't stop, will they?" he asked. Nira shook her head. "No." Dan ran a hand through his hair. He had hoped to lay low until the danger passed, but that wasn't an option. Sooner or later, the hunters would find them. The only choice was to leave Vestenine. But how? Most ships in the scrapyard were broken beyond repair. And even if he found one that worked, the colony's security forces would be watching all departures. He needed an idea. Fast. He turned back to Nira. "If we get off-world, do you have somewhere safe to go?" Nira hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "No home." Dan's chest tightened. She wasn't just running. She had nowhere to run to. She had lost everything. For the first time, he truly understood why she clung to him. He wasn't just someone who had helped her. He was all she had left. Dan sighed, leaning back against the scrap pile. He had never wanted to be a hero. He was just a mechanic, scraping by on a backwater colony. But now he had a choice. Leave Nira behind and go back to his quiet life. Or help her escape, knowing it would put him in danger too. He didn't have to think long. Looking at her, sitting there in silence, scared but still holding on, Dan knew he wasn't going to abandon her. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Together." Nira looked up at him, her violet eyes shining in the dim light. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out, just a small movement, grasping the edge of his sleeve. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it said more than words ever could. Dan gave a small nod. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were in this together. Dan crouched behind a pile of broken ship parts, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The scrapyard stretched out before him like a rusted graveyard of forgotten machines. Somewhere beyond the wreckage, hunters were searching for them. Nira sat beside him, her silver skin dim in the moonlight. She was quiet, but he could tell she was still afraid. Her fingers curled around the fabric of her sleeve, gripping it tightly. Dan exhaled. They needed to leave the planet. That much was clear. But how? Most of the ships here were beyond repair. The ones that weren't were either locked down by colony security or missing essential parts. Even if he could fix one, lifting off without authorization would be a risk. Still, a plan was better than waiting to be found. He turned to Nira. "We need a ship, a working one." She nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "You okay?" he asked. She blinked and looked away. Tired. Dan understood. She had been running, wounded, hunted, and now forced into another escape. She hadn't had a real moment to rest. But they couldn't afford to stop. Dan glanced around the scrapyard, scanning for any usable ships. He spotted an old jump craft at the far end of the yard, half buried under discarded plating. The hull was dented, but the engine looked intact. That was their best bet. "Come on," he whispered, motioning for Nira to follow. They moved carefully, staying low, slipping between rusted ship parts. The air smelled of old fuel and metal, and every small sound seemed louder in the stillness of the night. As they reached the jump craft, Dan ran his hand along the side, checking the condition. The exterior was rough, but when he peered inside the exposed wiring, he saw something promising. The core system was still functional. He grinned. "I can fix this." Nira tilted her head. "Fast." Dan hesitated. "Maybe." The truth was, Repairing it would take time, more than they probably had. But he didn't have a better option. He pulled a toolkit from his bag and started working. Sparks flickered as he reconnected loose wires, his hands moving quickly. Years of repairing broken colony ships had given him plenty of experience, but this was different. This time, his life depended on it. Nira watched him silently. Then, after a moment, she closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Dan glanced at her. "You all right?" She didn't open her eyes. "They are close." His hands froze. "How close?" Nira pressed a hand to her chest, as if feeling something deep inside. Then her violet eyes opened. "Very close." Dan swore under his breath. The hunters were near. He worked faster, fingers tightening bolts, reconnecting circuits. The engine hummed faintly, weak but still alive. He just needed a little more time. A sharp beep echoed in the scrapyard. Dan's heart clenched. That wasn't from the ship. It was from a scanner. Someone was here. He grabbed Nira's wrist and pulled her down behind the jump craft. "Stay low." Footsteps crunched against the ground. Dan peered through a gap in the metal. His breath held. A figure in dark armor moved between the wreckage, a handheld scanner glowing in their grip. The hunter. Dan tightened his jaw. They had to stay hidden. Just a few more minutes. The hunter paused, turning slowly. Their scanner beeped again. Dan felt Nira tremble slightly beside him. She was scared. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance. The hunter took another step forward. The scanner beeped louder. Dan's mind raced. They needed a distraction. Something, anything, to draw attention away. His eyes darted to a loose fuel canister nearby. An idea formed. Carefully, he reached into his bag, pulling out a small tool. He flicked it at the canister. Clang. The metal echoed through the scrapyard. The hunters spun toward the sound, raising their weapon. Dan didn't wait. "Now," he whispered. He grabbed Nira's hand, and they ran. The jump craft's hatch was already open. Dan climbed in first, pulling Nira in behind him. He rushed to the cockpit and powered up the ship. The controls flickered. Systems booting. Engine warming up. Outside, the hunter turned back, realizing the trick. Dan slammed his hand on the controls. Come on, come on." The engine roared to life. The hunter raised their weapon. A red light flickered at the tip, energy charge loading. Dan didn't give them the chance. He gripped the throttle and launched the ship forward. The force shoved them back as the jump craft lifted, engines burning through the scrapyard. Sparks and debris scattered as they shot into the sky. Dan's hands tightened on the controls. The colony's defense system would detect an unauthorized launch any second now. "Hold on," he shouted. Nira clutched the seat, her violet eyes wide. The radar blinked. Multiple red signals. More incoming. Dan gritted his teeth. They weren't free yet. But they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The jump craft shook violently as it tore through the dark sky, escaping the scrapyard below. Dan gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the controls as he struggled to keep the ship steady. The radar flashed red, multiple signals closing in fast. "We've got company," he muttered. Nira clutched the seat beside him, her violet eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't need to ask. She could feel them coming. Dan flipped a few switches, pushing the ship's thrusters to their limit. "Hold on." The jump craft shot forward, engines roaring as it climbed higher. The colony's defense system was waking up now. Any unauthorized launch would trigger pursuit, and sure enough. Beep, beep. 2 small security drones appeared on the scanner, moving to intercept them. Dan cursed under his breath. They're fast. Nira's hands tightened. More coming. Dan didn't doubt it. The first drone locked onto their ship. A warning alarm blared in the cockpit. Dan's mind raced. The jump craft had no weapons, no shields, just speed. He yanked the controls hard, sending the ship into a sharp dive. The drone fired. A bright energy bolt shot past them, missing by inches. Dan pulled up just in time, twisting through the sky. "This thing's not built for dogfights," he shouted. The second drone fired. Dan rolled the ship, barely dodging the attack. The engine strained under the pressure, but he kept pushing it. They had to reach open space. Only then would they have a chance. But then, beep, beep, beep. A new signal appeared on the radar. Nira tensed. Them. Dan's stomach sank. The hunters had arrived. A sleek black ship entered the chase, moving faster than the colony drones. Unlike them, this one wasn't just following orders. This one was hunting. Dan's grip tightened. "We need an escape route. Now." Nira closed her eyes, her breath steadying. When she opened them again, she pointed. "There." Dan followed her gaze. A thick asteroid belt stretched beyond the colony's orbit, filled with floating debris and broken rock. It was dangerous, but it was also their only chance. Dan didn't hesitate. He yanked the controls and veered toward the belt. The colony drones hesitated, calculating the risk. But the hunter's ship, it didn't slow down. It was coming straight for them. Dan pushed the thrusters to max. The jump craft trembled as they entered the asteroid field. Huge rocks drifted around them, some spinning, some colliding with each other. One wrong move, and they'd be debris themselves. The first asteroid loomed ahead. Dan twisted the controls, slipping past it with barely a meter to spare. The ship scraped against another rock, sparks flying. The hunter's ship followed, weaving through the debris with deadly precision. Dan swore. "They're good." Nira watched the hunter's ship closely, her expression unreadable. Dan pulled the ship into another dive, dodging a massive asteroid. The hunter stayed close. Then, boom. One of the colony drones crashed into a rock, exploding in a burst of fire. Dan exhaled. One down. But the hunter was still there, and they were gaining. Dan glanced at Nira. "You sense anything?" She hesitated, then pointed again. Left. Dan didn't question her. He twisted the ship sharply, just as an asteroid suddenly spun into their path. The hunter hadn't expected it. Their ship swerved too late. Crash. The asteroid clipped the hunter's wing, sending their ship spiraling. Dan whooped. "Nice call." But the celebration didn't last. The engine flickered. A warning flashed on the screen. Dan's heart dropped. "We're losing power." Nira's eyes widened. "They hit us." Dan shook his head. "No, we pushed the engine too hard." The jump craft was failing. They had escaped the colony, but without a working engine, they weren't going anywhere. Dan exhaled. "We need to land. Somewhere safe." Nira looked out at the stars, her expression thoughtful. Then, slowly, she pointed. "There." Dan followed her gaze. A distant moon, small and dark, hidden in the shadows of the asteroid belt. Dan nodded. "All right, let's hope it's friendly." The jump craft drifted toward the moon, its engines sputtering. They had escaped for now. But the hunt wasn't over. The jump craft trembled as it drifted toward the small moon, its damaged engine barely holding together. Dan gripped the controls tightly, his jaw clenched. The emergency lights inside the cockpit flickered, warning of multiple system failures. "This ship won't last much longer," he muttered. Nira sat beside him, silent, her violet eyes fixed on the dark surface of the moon ahead. It was a lonely place, no lights, no signs of life, just endless rocky terrain. But they had no choice. Dan adjusted the controls, guiding the ship toward a flat clearing between jagged cliffs. "Hold on," he said as the jump craft descended. The landing was rough. The ship hit the ground hard, skidding over the rocky surface before finally coming to a stop. A cloud of dust rose around them, and then silence. Dan exhaled and leaned back in his seat. "We made it." Nira looked at him, then at the control panel, where sparks flickered. Ship. Dan sighed. It's done. We're not flying this thing again. She lowered her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Dan unbuckled his harness and stood up. Come on. Let's see what we've got out there. The ramp lowered with a heavy groan, and cold air rushed inside. Dan stepped onto the moon's surface, his boots crunching against the ground. Nira followed, her silver skin glowing faintly under the dim starlight. The landscape was barren, stretching endlessly in all directions. Sharp cliffs loomed in the distance, and strange rock formations cast long shadows. Dan placed his hands on his hips. Not exactly paradise. Nira walked forward a few steps, her gaze scanning the area. Then she closed her eyes. Dan watched her curiously. What are you doing? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood still, as if listening to something. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "Not alone." Dan tensed. "What do you mean?" Nira turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Something here." Dan's hand instinctively went to his side, even though he had no weapon, friendly or not. Nira hesitated. Then she shook her head. "Not danger." Dan exhaled. That was good enough. For now. They had no supplies, no way off this moon, and no idea what lay ahead. But at least they weren't in immediate danger. "All right," Dan said. "Let's find some shelter before anything finds us." They walked for a while, moving carefully over the uneven ground. The cold air bit at Dan's skin, but Nira didn't seem bothered. Then they reached a large rock formation with a narrow entrance leading into the cliffs. Dan stopped. "That looks like a cave." Nira nodded. "Safe." Dan wasn't sure about that, but it was better than staying out in the open. They stepped inside, the walls enclosing around them. The cave was deep, the air inside warmer than outside. Dan let out a breath of relief. "This'll do," he said, sitting down against the wall. His body ached from everything they had been through. Nira sat beside him, silent as always. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Dan broke the silence. "So, what now?" Nira looked at him. Her eyes held something new, something softer. She didn't answer right away. Then, after a pause, she said, "You saved me." Dan gave a small smile. "Yeah, well, I guess I couldn't just leave you behind." She lowered her gaze. "I have no home." Dan looked up at the dark cave ceiling. "Yeah, I figured." Silence settled between them again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. After a while, Nira spoke again. "Why?" Dan frowned. "Why what?" She met his gaze. "Why did you help me?" Dan thought about it. He had been asking himself the same question since the moment he found her. He could have walked away. He could have ignored her. But he didn't. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Maybe because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." Nira studied him for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed a hand over his. Dan glanced at her, surprised. Her touch was cool, but gentle, and in that moment, he understood. She wasn't just thanking him. She was telling him that she wasn't alone anymore. And neither was he. Dan smiled, squeezing her hand lightly. "We'll figure something out." Nira nodded. Outside, the cold wind howled against the cliffs. But inside the cave, for the first time in a long time, they were safe and together.